Welcome everyone again now to this ESG Communication Masterclass, which are organized by your media monitoring, measurement and insight partner, Ruepoint. My name is Raina Lazarova, and I am the co-founder of Ruepoint and global chair of AMEC, the International Association for Measurement and Evaluation of Communication. This masterclass is part of AMEC's Measurement Month, almost through now, 3 more days to go. AMEC's Measurement Month provides a month-long focus of free events for everyone on best practices and new emerging trends in measurement and evaluation of communication. Don't forget to use the hashtag #AMECMM so we can help amplify your message in social channels as you listen through or in the post this webinar. So I would like to invite you all also to ask questions to the panelists in the Q&A section of the Zoom session. Please feel free to ask Natasha anything that comes to your mind. We are up for a very engaging and thought-provoking session, and I look forward to seeing your questions and asking Natasha. So before I give Natasha the floor and hand over to her, I would like to just make a quick introduction. And I think the topic says it all. ESG communication is a topic that's much broader than what we would usually talk about at Measurement Month. And we specifically chose a topic that almost casts the net wider for all of you communicators out there who are wrestling with the challenges of everyday work and wider global, societal, and otherwise issues. And they become, increasingly part of our everyday life, as well as the challenges we're dealing with in our work. Natasha Plowman is Communications Strategy and Sustainability Consultant at Spinning Red. Natasha has worked across communications, corporate and public affairs disciplines in wide-ranging businesses and sectors, from financial services to FMCG. A campaigner at heart, Natasha has developed and executed high-profile thought leadership and behavioral change campaigns, from running responsible drinking campaigns and issues at Diageo to the Global Insight Thought Leadership campaign HSBC Navigator. She led employee and stakeholder strategies to change perceptions of the role of sustainable finance in driving business transition at HSBC, and has been a sustainability and issues consultant for P&G's fabric care and beauty brands with the global agency Ketchum. Recently, she was a strategic advisor to a bank in Saudi Arabia on the development of their sustainable finance strategy, and developed a training course for teams to engage in ESG with clients ranging from global companies to small and medium enterprises. So as you can see, we have probably one of the best experts on the market out there. And with that, I would like to welcome you, Natasha, to the ESG Communication Masterclass and hand over to you.
Thank you very much for that welcome. And thank you very much for having me, and for everyone, and welcome to everyone here today. So first off, I'm going to set up and get the presentation up on the deck. It should take around 35 to 40 minutes. Feel free to kind of ask questions or clarifications in the talk. And I'll also give a heads up. If the doorbell goes, my dog is going to go crazy, and I will try and mute and shut that. But I'm hoping that the post has been and everything has been, if there's anything like that happens, the joys of the wider family. So just let me.
Story of my life, yeah.
It is definitely. And have we passed the first hurdle of having the full screen? Yes. Awesome. Okay, let me just move some things around here. So what we're going to talk about today is transforming with sustainability, and how do you future-proof your business. It is such a wide-ranging issue, and a lot of the terms that I'll use are used interchangeably. And I think there's quite a big conversation and debate around terminology in this space, and particularly when it comes to ESG. So I will try and navigate that with you as well, because words matter, but often I think they get caught up in the quagmire to kind of make people focus on the wrong things when they start debating if it's ESG or it is sustainability more broadly. So what we will discuss today is first off the complexity for business. So, and there's a first section which just shows all the different areas the businesses have to be aware of and keep abreast of that are changing rapidly. I am not a reporting expert, and I'm certainly not, a materiality expert. There are so many different depths of experiences here, but my role here is around looking at the guardrails for communications. So particular focus on kind of the various facets of greenwashing, but also what role can businesses play to communicate who to and why. And then in the third section will be, well, what can you do and how do you set your strategy up? And that could be for if you're an existing business or you're setting up a kind of a new business, or if you're a legacy business, or if you're in a business to transition versus sustainability business. And I think fundamentally is because, the requirement for business to transform is not going to go away. The drivers for it are changing, and we'll talk about that in a moment, from being business as a force for good to risk mitigation as well. But the fundamental thing is business always adapts and changes, and this is one part of that. So just to start off and get a bit of grounding is kind of be honest about where you and your business may be now. And it might be different parts depending on what size of business yours is. You've got various levels from kind of green labelers, what we coin, which is there is a responsibility of sustainability. There is an understanding of, what the issues are, but it's an addition to the day job. It isn't fundamental to the decision-making of the company. And also when it comes to reporting, it's you're reporting what you're doing rather than really looking at transformation. And this is fundamentally around how does businesses change and adapt and transform. Then you can also go from when you have that great understanding of where your business is, what do you need to reduce? And how do you kind of reduce to risk to the business, but also reduce your impact on planet or kind of your impact on the people and the communities you're operating in. And you'll start delivering specific environmental activities, but it may be seen as an avoidable cost rather than necessarily something that is driving decision-making. And, and this is where a lot of companies are, and that it is not a moral judgment about where that company may be. And also companies may ebb and flow through those three areas as well. But when you kind of look at leaders, and I think this one needs to be updated at the moment. And I think after this conversation, we'll look at and maybe one of the questions will be, well, what does leadership really mean because of the polarization, because of the politicization of sustainability we're seeing at the moment? But, when we looked at leaders before, it was a lot around how they collaborate with partners and customers to innovate, and how, to look at environmentally friendly products and processes. And really sustainability becomes part of the business fabric and decision-making. And obviously that is something that we would like to see, that it becomes not just a nice to have that sit in a siloed part of the company, but is really integrated into the decision making and the trade-offs that businesses need to make through a sustainability and through an impact lens that they have on society. So I think it's really interesting to kind of, when you're considering this, kind of consider where your business is now, where you might want them to be. And as we talk through this session, what would be the implications, trade-offs and decisions you need to make to kind of move through those three levels. And of course, there's lots of iterations in between of that as well. And I think there's, I love this. I recently went to the Peanuts Museum, and this is where some of these come from. But I love this quote from Lucy. It's this kind of whole idea, and we get into this of, if everybody agreed with me, that'd all be all right. And and that and this is part of the problem, the echo chambers of people just thinking my way is the only way, and anyone who deviates from that is wrong. And unfortunately, this is kind of a real problem that we have in society, not having the right debates and ability to debate of those. But I still like Lucy anyway. But I mean, one thing which is really kind of quite worrying is that we are going back in some circles to debating climate change and weather events and looking at, is this man-made and what is the implications and what is the response, or, it's all kind of manufactured and this is just changing weather. Whereas for most people, and the vast majority of people, it is focusing on severity and response. So we're seeing these big change in weather events. We are seeing implications of a kind of a warming world. And so how does business adapt to those from a risk perspective, but also preparing for the future is going to be the core part of conversations of sustainability. And I mean, the big thing for me was always, you know, this whole period we went to of these kind of target setting and navel gazing about what sustainability meant is over. Now it's really needs to be focused on actions, but recognizing the complexity of that. And the complexity is often the competing demands. It's about the choices and trade-offs you need to be making as a business. It isn't all clean sailing. And it also means that we need to kind of make those decisions through the lens of profits and business continuity and what the role of businesses in society. And we'll kind of talk a bit about the greenwashing lens as well. So, I mean, this is where we kind of get a little bit of the conversation around, is it ESG, is it sustainability, and what does it all mean? But, you know, fundamentally, if we look at, is it the right vehicle to drive change, and what the role of business, and also to consider what your clients may need or want from you. So there's kind of three main areas that we look at through kind of an ESG lens. The first one is, what is ESG? Now, a lot of the debates around ESG are coming from, you know, saying ESG is dead. It's, you know, it's done its business. It's kind of, it's not relevant to society. But what makes up ESG are still just as relevant. If you think about ESG as kind of the parameters that help you report, and it was created and used as a financial tool to kind of look at that non-financial performance of a company, then it is just as relevant, even if some of the tools and some of the kind of the measurements have been a little bit more blurred and politicized of late. But when you look at those three pillars, they are the three pillars that still guide companies, from the environmental, so the impact on climate change and the growing impact of nature and natural resources and biodiversity, to social, so the human capital, where's your, you know, looking at talent both now and in the future. Look at your stakeholders and your social opportunities and your supply chains, particularly from a human lens, is also incredibly important to consider. And then also, I think all of this is underpinned by corporate governance and good corporate governance. And a lot of the conversations we're seeing much more now around transparency, openness, much better dialogue, and that all comes to having a really robust and strong corporate behavior and corporate governance. So I don't think ESG is dead in any way. I think there are some facets of it that are going to be questioned, but as a kind of way of deciding and determining what the parts of the business that then respond to this, it's still an important area. And then we've got like the Sustainable Development Goals. I know the deadline for them was 2030, and it's really quite shocking that that's only 5 years away. And again, it covers the ESG levels, but it gives you a lot more framework to kind of different areas that your business might be focusing on as well. Again, useful information to be able to help you guide your strategy as you're moving forward. And another one to decipher this is like adding in a fourth area. So you've got the principles of governance, you've got planet, you've got people, but then you've got prosperity. And you've got prosperity, which looks at kind of also profit, but also license to operate. And how does, you know, the economics of the business become more entwined in it? And I think that's a really important addition to consider for business, that we can't shy away and ignore. The businesses are there to make a profit, and businesses are there to kind of also, but it's how those profits get made that are an important one to consider as well. So it does, you know, all of these different areas. And I think one of the dangers we've got with these is an expectation that you need to be doing something against everything. And you need to be, you know, the overwhelm of that complexity can feel too much. We're also in a situation where the kind of the outrage of what you do or don't do is something that is kind of used to drag people down. And, you know, it's looking at, well, what is in your gift to solve? What can you actually get involved in to kind of have an impact on the stakeholders you're looking at? And that's where we'll kind of look at where greenwashing is going to become it's an important way to help you make those decisions as well. But before we go into that, I'm just going to give a very top line whistle stop of kind of where some of the scrutiny and where some of the business, what's been said in different regions around the world. And this is very top line. There'll be so much more underneath it as well, particularly for your regions. And it'll be really interesting to hear your perspective as we go into the conversation about that as well. So if we look at the Americas, I mean, everyone's talking about the Americas since the election. What we've seen from the Americas that we've got kind of really NGOs who are kind of very vocal and especially combative. And for some brands, they're being targeted by eco brands, which are funded by these NGOs as well, to kind of get something onto the agenda and drive change for the kind of legacy companies. Of course, being the Americas, you kind of have this increasing focus on litigation, but also there is increasing focus on product packaging scrutiny and the advertising and claims. This is something in Europe we've become a lot more accustomed to, whereas those kind of scrutiny has been quite difficult. But the increased politicization is also slowing policy progress. And also we're having that whole issue of uneven implementation. So you have, and this is where we keep on hearing about red states and blue states, particularly in North America, around, where kind of discussions around sustainability or discussions around governance might be skewed depending on what the political environments of those states are, which makes it incredibly difficult for companies to be able to navigate that. But then when we kind of consider, well, who are you talking to and what are the communications that you want to deliver, then we start kind of reflecting that you may need to adapt and change some of that in response to the different political climate as well. If we look at Europe, Europe is seen as the leading in regulation. Both we've got lots of regulation that's come down in the last year and is kind of being implemented from 2025. You see enforcement both at a regional and also a local level, where markets and countries are able to adapt their legislation and enforcement to the kind of the European legislation as well. Consumer scrutiny is at an all-time high. You see particularly markets like Germany who have had a very big focus around efficacy of sustainability claims and making sure that, and they're a very educated market around the impact of the products that they're using on the environment and climate. And that does tend to be much more an environment consideration. And also, of course, the EU's New Deal for consumers has introduced higher fines for business and the kind of the ability for kind of individual and collective damages claims. There's also a lot of discussion in probably Europe around who pays and the user pays principle. For a lot of markets, to make sure they kind of polluter pays, and to ensure that we have that embedded, that governments are able to get more money from businesses who are seen as impacting the environment and the climate negatively as well. So there'll be a lot more happening around that in the near future, and how businesses then jostled to kind of reduce their burden, but also reflect where they are as far as the pollution and the impact they're having. For Asia, and Asia is one of, again, all these regions are hugely divergent anyway, and as is Asia, but we're seeing like a really evolving consumer visibility and activism. We're also seeing that activism come from being the brunt of many climate shocks, and we're seeing that across the world as well. But also you look at kind of the Middle East, which gets kind of caught up into that kind of the Asia world as well, are kind of key players, or should be key players in the energy transition. So from the kind of the visibility and activism, increasing demand for more sustainable products for both consumers and investors, and new initiatives in finance taxonomies are driving that increased activity as well. What we consider is that likely where green claims is going with Europe, Asia could follow. But again, like with other regions, that enforcement is become more important. Having a legislation and regulation is one thing, ensuring that the enforcement actually drives change and kind of that policy and language and action is together is important. And I think, and Africa is a hugely important area, and kind of African voices really came out last week at the kind of around COP and the finance deal around COP, and development and sustainability are intertwined. So what you may as a company might be doing and the language you may use from a sustainability perspective in kind of Europe or the global north wouldn't necessarily land in the same way in the global south if you don't have the development mechanisms intertwined with it as well. But of course, consumer scrutiny, they also see they are the brunt of a lot of the climate shocks and the climate focus we're seeing, but we need to kind of make sure that the economic, social and human needs around development and around economic prosperity and success get shared effectively across the continent as well. And you know but it is good to see that there is a growing influence in international forums from the global south, and being kind of their voices being heard, both from a development perspective and the access to money to develop, but also from to be able to develop in a way that doesn't damage the environment in the same way that the north has developed over decades as well. So that is a very kind of top line whistle stop of the of some of the different areas of the regions. There is, you know, even though we see politically regions and countries kind of becoming more insular, you know, the thing with climate and the environment is it isn't kind of bound to kind of nation states. So there will always be a requirement for the politics and the international dialogue to kind of get that consistency happening around the world, so we don't have the losers and kind of winners and losers diverging ever more. So that's kind of an introduction, kind of a bit of a state of the nation. Now I want to go to what I call the double-edged sword of scrutiny. There are so many discussions around greenwashing and what is greenwashing and definitions of it. And, you know, it is multifaceted. And it also has kind of huge levels of impact on the business and how you might want to communicate. And often when we come to the end, when we start talking about what can you do, I mean, through this, a lot of people think, well, it's just all too hard. And I think, but the fundamental question is, why are you communicating, and to who, and to what end? And sometimes the actions you take are the actions you take that may not need a whole communication unless you're changing an attitude or changing a behavior. So I think the conversation around greenwashing is going to increasingly change, but we have to make sure that that doesn't stop the actions on the back of what people need to do to transform be limited as well. So we know the kind of the risks are multifaceted and wide-ranging, you know, and so we have the legal risk, and we're seeing particularly in Europe that legal risk being increased. The financial risk, either from fines or from, you know, or from particularly from fines or not doing the right thing. So, or your brand being caught up in a reputational risk, or you're being fined for greenwashing, you're being fined for not adhering to the legislation and regulations around kind of pollution or something like that. So there is always a financial implication to greenwashing as well. And then we'll talk about reputational risk. If your kind of brand is caught up into it, we've seen quite a lot being said around airlines lately, and how do they navigate, you know, being wanting to change the market, but then also having the right language to be able to talk about the change they're making to kind of use of different fuels. And of course, the increasing reporting costs. I mean, that's a big discussion next year as CSRD comes into force, is, you know, so much of, and like, how do we move from reporting being a value add that then drives change of behavior, from where we're seeing reporting just being kind of a tick box exercise in some companies and a cost to people. So there are kind of 6 or so areas that we talk around the different areas of greenwashing. And one area which I kind of coined is hiding in plain sight. So it's where you're kind of relying on being part of a group of companies or like a trade association, and your entire focus on environmental sustainability and ESG is tied up into that membership of that group. Now, there's been, you know, those coalitions are incredibly important. You often have the same problems and issues. You often have the same, you can share ideas, deliver outcomes, be clear on the actions you're taking. You have shared companies within your supply chains. So being part of that coalition is incredibly important. But what also comes to the other side of that is being also aware of how is that coalition lobbying, influencing, and speaking about sustainability and environmentalism in the right way that kind of is aligned to what your business is saying. And what they found, and what Unilever found recently, is they did a big research project with kind of the huge amount of trade associations they are members of, and started saying that some of them were lobbying in counter to what our stated corporate position was. And a lot of NGOs are also looking at companies and saying, you're saying this as a company, but your trade association, which you also support, fund, and is saying something else. So getting that alignment within a business is increasingly important as well. So to make sure that consistency happens, and there are so many different trade associations that do different things, and it's being able to kind of be open and be able to have that flow of communication through your business to ensure that you haven't left a door open to be criticised. And then this, oh my God, look here, it's where you spotlight certain features of your product or operations to draw, and it can be accused that through doing that, you're drawing attention away from other practices. A couple of years ago, HSBC was put up for using advertising to promote investments they were making, and it's kind of the whole focus of those investments to help their clients transition to net zero. But it was also highlighting a philanthropic money they were doing to kind of plant trees and nature-based solutions at the same time. And it was a really interesting conversation at the time, because while all those things were true and those things were happening, when it was looked at in the entirety of the exposure and the impact of the bank, it was felt that it was highlighting one particular area without taking into context the entire bank's impact. Now, it's really hard to navigate this because, and this is when we talk about polarization, is that, you want to be able to highlight these things that you're doing. And so what do you do to kind of say, yes, but you have to put in context of, yes, we're investing in X billion or X trillion into either of these solutions, and that is this proportion of our total bank exposure, and that's what we're trying to change. So the language of finance, I think, is going to start changing to kind of put things into context. And it's like with other companies where you're doing one thing, how do you then make sure that you put in context of the wider impact you're doing and make those decisions to ensure that you just be aware of how it can be called up. And in the same context, you've got look here, then you have look there. So it's where it's saying this isn't, we have no control over what's happening here as a company. All of the impact we have, or the vast majority of the impact we have, is consumer use, or the vast majority of the impact isn't down to us, it's down to the kind of companies, our supply chain, and we can't influence them. And on the one hand, yes, that is absolutely true. From a supply chain perspective, for most businesses, the biggest impact, particularly from a climate or from an energy perspective, comes from their supply chains, or carbon comes from their supply chains. But they also have a role to be able to influence and help and support their suppliers to become more energy efficient, as an example, or to have less impact on nature and biodiversity. And having that awareness and transparency is going to be something that's going to be ever more important for big businesses in particular. But then when you have the onus shifting to consumer use, and there are limitations of what a company can do to influence the behavior of consumers. But what the role of companies can do is to make it as easy as possible. And then you have kind of implications for that. So, for example, I think how many people, and you see this on kind of social media, particularly Americans, complaining about the bottle caps being attached to bottles now. And the rationality of that is quite clear. Bottle caps are too small to go through recycling, so if they stay attached to the bottle, they're much more easily to recycle. And it became a EU directive. And then everyone kind of starts saying, well, I just rip them off kind of really hard and do it, because the consumer use of it isn't what consumer experience isn't what I want. But you can see why they saw bottle recycling was a big impact is a big impact for them. And so this is one way they wanted to change it. The education around why wasn't probably as high as it could have been. And therefore, they were just putting the onus onto consumers to kind of deal with the changes they'd made. And you also have other areas around how we use our products in the home, particularly around washing dishes, washing clothes, how energy efficient are the different products we're using and the different machines we're using. And brands can have a role to play in innovation to make that easier for consumers to make that choice. But the whole point is you can't shift the full onus onto consumers. It is very much around the business needs to also own the product that they're innovating and creating as well. Death by label is, and I was having an interesting conversation with someone the other day, is around how do brands decide what labels they put on to guide consumers to what they need to do with that product, or if is that product adhering to certain criteria. But then we had this whole issue of various organizations creating their own labeling structure, which had nothing behind it at all. So we're seeing a lot more emphasis around getting the kind of regulations around what labels you can do, what claims you can make. They're already in place. And we need to have that much more consistent across industries as well. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is often the cost on business to put these labels on to their different products, be it kind of fair trade, soil association, etc. So we need to build much more trust in that labeling to ensure that the companies that have it are actually doing the right thing. And I mean, we spoke before around targets and targets everywhere. I think the whole flurry of target setting seems to have is to calm down quite a lot, because a lot of companies were setting these targets at a time and are kind of hiding behind those targets, but there really wasn't a proper roadmap for the transition that they were doing. So, and it really kind of comes a situation, you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. And then the action or the roadmap hasn't been made, even though they've said they're going to do these targets. And actually what we're seeing now is that look, when these targets aren't being achieved or they're not being met, the communication narrative of how they respond to that has been really interesting, as well as the people who are calling out people aren't responding to it. And I think, Lego was a really good example recently where, they made a kind of commitment to have all of the bricks made from recycled plastic. And then when they went into how they could actually do this, it was found that the energy consumption, the carbon implications of making that transition was higher than using virgin plastic. And while they didn't walk away from the commitment, they did walk away from the timings they'd set for it, because they recognized that while they were doing one thing, which was kind of reducing their use on virgin plastic, the implications were something else, which was an increasing level of carbon going into the environment. And I found it really interesting watching the examples of it, because when Unilever stepped back from some of its targets and started reviewing and changing things, everyone was in kind of like, oh, how could they do this? This is terrible. And actually having a little bit more nuance into the conversation and having a little bit more boldness around, okay, we can't do this, but this is what we're going to try and do, and this is how we're going to try and operate, is a really good way that we need to start talking around to the transition. Because when we get into the next one, which is I think the biggest danger we've got for a lot of companies around just stopping talking, kind of the hide and seek of what they're trying to do, or green hushing, will not speaking about what they're doing then make companies reduce the actions they're taking. And there is kind of, and this is I think one of the dangers we've got at the moment as sustainability becomes more polarized and politicized, is that with less scrutiny becomes less sharing, less learning and understanding of the huge complexity, and therefore people just stay with the status quo. And what we need to be challenging at the moment is not dragging companies down who are struggling to make those transitions and changes, but to kind of start having a better conversation around the complexity and not hide away from it, but then also ensure that we continue on that path to driving change that we need to be doing as well. And I think with this whole notion of hide and seek, or this whole notion of green hushing, is fundamentally around the political polarization that we're seeing around sustainability, and the fear that companies have of either not doing the changes they need to make or not being able to because of the trade-offs and the decisions they need to make. And so instead of discussing and being open about that, they'd rather just hide behind the parapet and not say anything at all. And so how do we get that right corporate body language to be able to kind of be open around the complexity and the nuances without kind of shutting down and saying nothing at all? So I think that's a really interesting one that we kind of continually being talked about, but it must be talked about in the context of, I can kind of understand why companies are wanting to kind of shut up shop and not actually share what they're doing, because it's become so much more polarized. And then it's another one which I think is becoming much more important that we're talking about, is how do we price risk and how do we price the transition for businesses need to be making. So we talked before around climate change and biodiversity loss, and not philosophical questions or moral dilemmas and they shouldn't be phrased as philosophical questions or moral dilemmas. There are physics, chemistry, and biology that are imposing those practical and non-negotiable limits on the status quo and business as usual. And I kind of have already seen that there is kind of a huge amount of money identified to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's two parts to this. One is, how does a company price the risk of doing nothing? So that would be the impact on their supply chain. That would be the impact on their, particularly in different sectors, if you're particularly in food, will be the impact of weather shocks on the food supply chain and therefore food prices to the consumer. And then also the pricing of transition, and that could be putting in all the measures to reduce your carbon and your energy use, and the industries that are created around that. And it's again, this whole debate has been quite polarized, where someone says we need to do carbon capture and the investment in carbon capture and create the market for that, then who pays to actually have that stability of a market? But the opportunities are there. We just need to start kind of thinking around, are we going after change or are we going after the status quo? And how do we kind of stop murking the waters around what those two efforts are? So, and fundamentally and cynically, money is the great common denominator, and therefore being able to kind of talk and understand the risks and the opportunities and how do you price that is a really powerful way to kind of be able to navigate through all the other areas that we've talked about around transition and greenwashing. It's a lot, isn't it? It's kind of, when you really think about it, it is, I can see why businesses get too complex. So how do we go to the next section, which is how do we move to action? So, and I mean, even just talking through this now, you can see why the complexity is there, and you can understand why so many businesses are kind of trying to, navigate through treacle basically of the actions that they need to take while being told you need to do a lot more. So I think there's kind of one, the first bit is kind of you have to put in the work. We've gone are the days where you could kind of just put a windmill or something green and therefore show that you're doing the sustainability. The work needs to be done, and you need to be honest around what are the implications of the products, the services, the business you're doing, and stop being vague. So, I mean, the reporting and the reporting systems are incredibly good as a mechanism to get you to know your baseline and to get to know your operations and to understand what regulations and laws you might fall under. And then, the organizations you're a part of are incredibly important, because it's what is the rest of your sector doing and what are your customers asking of you? So all those questions are really important to be able to give you that baseline and give you an understanding of where you are now, to be able to start making really good targets about where you might want to be in the future. And fundamentally, it's about reducing your impact on the planet and having a better impact on people. So how do you set those goals? But I think the other thing to be aware of is, there are mechanisms like life cycle analysis, or the kind of financial targets in context of your business and sector are kind of really important to kind of ask those right questions, to put in the work to be able to make those changes. Data is incredibly important, but I think we've also got caught up because data isn't always readily available. It isn't always trusted. There is so much data floating around, and this is where measurements and the interpretation and analysis of data is incredibly important, because the data should be there to give you a baseline to help you make decisions about where you want to go in the future. And if the data doesn't give you that, or it doesn't enable you to make those decisions, then are you in death by data, basically? And it's being able to decipher and analyze that incredibly well. And I think, and this is where the greenwashing area becomes quite interesting around communications. Yes, you can share your challenges and opportunities and bring others with you. But, it's always it's not communications for communication's sake. It's communications to an end, and a communications to be, are you bringing other people with you and helping them understand what you're trying to do as a business? Or are you kind of communicating because you want to pat yourself in the back and say you've done a job well done? Now, that's not necessarily bad, but, what is the end goal of the communications you're doing? And be really clear on those audiences you're trying to influence. And so I think, these are some questions that can maybe help guide the decision-making for any communications that you might want to do. I mean, fundamentally, will it help me sell more? will me putting a windmill or kind of making some kind of claim on a product that I've got help me sell more product? And therefore you need to understand where your consumer is now, where your consumer might want to be at the end, you know, and make that kind of rational decision around it as well, rather than kind of, but not be cynical about kind of trying to jump on a bandwagon. I think that's where the regulations have come down very, very hard and should do as well. Will it help my customers be more sustainable? So if the innovation I'm doing as a company, does that help them? So in particularly smaller companies who are within larger supply chains, how do they ensure that's communicated up the chain well? Can I get better access to capital investment? There's kind of a lot of talk around sustainable finance. There's a lot of talk around sustainable finance, not necessarily delivering the changes that need to make. There is other debates that all finance should be sustainable finance, and therefore it should all be directed through the lens of, does this kind of have a sustainable outcome, be it reducing impact on climate, or does it have a ability to help businesses transform and change? So if you're investing in something, can you access capital investment because you're trying to do something more sustainable? And then, you know, the industry operations, how does it kind of change practice in my industry? But, you know, ultimately, and the fundamental first question is, who cares and why? And then, so who are you influencing and why, and to what outcome? And I think it's kind of, and then start thinking about what you want to say. And my fundamental approach to kind of strategy, regardless if it's sustainability or any kind of business comm strategy, is, you know, being really clear on the audience you're trying to influence and where they are now. And then kind of figure out, well, what are you trying to deliver to them? What are you trying to make them do differently or act differently or think differently? And then you start thinking about what you want to say. And I think though that premise is incredibly important when thinking through a sustainability lens, because I think often we've fallen into the trap of kind of saying, we've done this really cool thing, let's just tell everyone about it. And, you know, but the kind of the impact or the implications to your audience or to the business outcomes aren't as clear. And that's when you get into danger of greenwashing. And just to kind of wrap up, if people aren't following Alison Taylor, I encourage you to. She wrote this book this year called Higher Ground. And I think it's really important to kind of put into context around how businesses are navigating a turbulent world. There's a lot of writing about this at the moment, and it's not as a way to kind of stop businesses acting, but to start businesses acting in a much more cohesive and structured way around, you know, looking at their stakeholders and what they need to impact. And it's not about spin, it's about, you know, that transition and the adaptation that we talked about at the beginning. So I think this quote is always kind of quite good. So today, being a good business doesn't call for exaggeration, spin, or overreach. It's not about setting rules, pitching an appealing story, or listing your achievements. The time-ordered approaches have lost potency. They're losing their grip. You'll need to imagine and establish firm foundations in order to aim high. And I think through the greenwashing lens, it enables you to ask the right questions and enables you to kind of put in place the right actions to be able to kind of deliver the change and transformation you need to do. And it's not easy. So it's definitely something that, you know, requires some thought and complexity. So that's a whistle stop. I think that's gone very quickly. I'm sorry if it's kind of sped on. So I'm Natasha from Spinning Reds, and I'll stop sharing now if there's any, so we can go for questions.
Fantastic. Thanks, Natasha. That was fascinating to hear. And as you say, it's not easy and it's multifaceted. And this is why it requires focus and also making sure that what you do is relevant at any given moment in time. Before I pick up some of the questions from the audience, I wanted to unpack a few of the points that you touched upon during your presentation. And I think I will start with one that is triggered by an event or meeting I recently had. It's about the regional sustainability differences. I recently spoke with a senior comms director from the maritime industry, operating in Europe and America. And what was clearly communicated is they're reporting that whilst in Europe, there's a strong focus on those standards and making sure that what you buy and purchase in the industry meets certain standards. In the US, it sounds like cash is king, cost is king. There's less of a focus on sustainable solutions when it comes to the kind of pure commercial decision making in this industry? I'm not suggesting that that's the case everywhere, but obviously an example that's probably relevant to others. Is this something that you have observed elsewhere? And I guess on a more general note, how can companies operating across multiple geographies and regions harmonize their sustainability strategies? When you're a global organization, you operate in the Americas, Europe, and Asia. If you are the kind of VP of comms of this global organization, how do you go about harmonizing strategies?
I suppose, I mean, I'd probably question when people say that in Europe, cash and profitability isn't king, because for any business, it absolutely is. And I think one of the problems we've got is a bit of issues around narrative and issues around talking about things in Europe in the same way that we probably need to get back to a little bit, not as a consequence of or as a difference to, the changes that are being made. But I do fundamentally think from a business perspective that consistency comes from understanding business risk and business opportunity, and the risk being looking forward. Like every big business has a strategic function that looks at kind of where the risks might be coming and where, those opportunities might lie. And it's about having a sustainability and a transition focus within those discussions that is important to be had. So and then it's kind of like, well, who do you need to be talking to and why? So, and if it's not driving a business outcome, then the question is, do we need to be talking about it in the same way that we may have done in the past in Europe and in Americas? So I do think there's a consistency across all markets and for all businesses around profitability, around cash, and around driving growth. I think the other thing is just, is it growth at all costs? Is it risk at all costs? Or is it something else that we need to be considering that looks at kind of balancing and tempering that? Because business wants consistency more than anything else. Very few businesses like to operate in a time of complete and utter chaos. And, and that's where you'll see a lot of the markets, a lot of businesses operate, is when they can kind of get that level baseline of rules.
Yeah, and I guess kind of leading from that as well, you spoke a lot about greenwashing, and in our everyday, we deal with the challenge of, and I guess communicators deal with the challenge of having to get cut through of what their organizations, businesses, brands are doing in terms of sustainability and ESG. I hear more and more colleagues report that journalists are a bit more skeptical, probably fair to say. They say, well, this is, what you're telling me is hygiene. Why should I be reporting on something that your organization is doing? Everyone should be doing that type of thing. How do you deal with that challenge? And I mean, I guess back to your point around it needs to have business meaning, but how do you build a story that has cut through?
To who? And I think that's the kind of the fundamental question is, who does your story need to have cut through to? What are you trying to influence with that story? And I think, the trust that people have both in businesses and the media and all the institutions that we have that make society is the biggest byproduct and problem that we've got. So when you're kind of saying, I need cut through, then it's kind of, well, who do you need to have cut through to? And if it's your stakeholders and it's the kind of people you need to make some changes or do difference, and the communications need to be much more targeted, a lot more specific. And that goes back to that whole kind of other issue of stop chasing volume of metrics and stop chasing the kind of the big story, because the big story is often kind of fueled in a time of outrage. Whereas if you're a lot more specific about that cut through you need to do, and you have a real outcome that you're delivering both for the audience but also the business, then it becomes a much more interesting dialogue for people to be having. It becomes a lot more grounded as well. But I think the idea that you kind of want to be famous for doing something that is just unimportant and doesn't actually drive anything other than making you feel good is the area that kind of the communications has got to walk away from more.
And you spoke about volume of mentions, right? And we'll be remiss not to talk about measuring success in ESG communication. One of the questions we had from the audience here is, what are the metrics or indicators that you believe are most effective in evaluating the success of sustainability initiatives? Is there a kind of benchmark that works across different sectors that can be applied, or equally, do we need to be looking at sector-based metrics and KPIs, what would be the advice you give
Mm.
practitioners who are just starting on that, outside of the reporting you spoke about, if they need to report within the organization, within kind of upstream to the C-suite, the effectiveness of their sustainability comms, what should they be looking at?
But is it the effectiveness of the sustainability comms, or is it the effectiveness of the sustainability actions they're making? So it's kind of like, what comes first? And obviously, I would say that the comms is a byproduct, an end product, because the comms will enable you to deliver your actions. If the comms enable you to build partnerships, to have people to educate and inform and change behavior or change attitudes, then that's the role of that comms to do, and you'll measure against that success, which is should be bog standard comms measurement around kind of impact measurement anyway. But it should be done in the context of what are you trying to achieve in the actions you're trying to take. So and that's where I think it needs to be a lot more intertwined with it. So lose any kind of metrics around kind of reach and volume and those kind of things that don't give you a real understanding of what the impact of the particular program you're delivering on, because that doesn't actually drive kind of change at all.
So ultimately, the advice is look at the impact, look at the objective of why you're doing what you're doing and the impact it's delivering.
Yeah, and to who? Yeah,
and to what stakeholders? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Another question that I wanted to touch upon from the Q&A is you spoke about profitability as part of a wider prosperity concept, and balancing profit and purpose can sometimes be viewed as tricky. Profit still remains the main reason why shareholder value, enterprise value, whatever you want to call it, stock value, remains the purpose of why businesses exist.
Yep.
So how can businesses reconcile profitability with meaningful sustainability goals? How can they reconcile the conflict that sometimes may exist between investing in sustainability and achieving, achieving business goals? Is it a question of short-term versus long-term? Is there a conflict at all?
There is, definitely short-term aspirations is often in conflict to most things because it doesn't drive the change we need to do. But I do think sustainability needs to be seen through the lens of risk and on the converse, risk and opportunity. And so therefore it's looking at understanding. So depending on what industry you're in, I think food is really, really interesting at the moment. And I think food isn't being spoken enough about as a sector because it's so susceptible to climate shocks, and it's so susceptible to supply chain resilience, or what's the opposite to resilience? I should know that. And therefore that has to be priced into the strategy, and it always has to be priced into kind of what is the return that you're going to get at different times. And so therefore looking at it and looking at how do you reduce your impact, how do you reduce your reliance, and how do you increase your resilience in these factors becomes part of your business strategy, which gets built in to your whole P&L and your profit and loss and what you're looking at as a business. And I think increasingly that's what needs to happen as well. And when you add in consumer attitudes, consumer beliefs and everything, all of those things needs to start being priced in a different way. So we start looking at where are consumers going to be in the future and what is going to drive their purchase decisions. And there's a big fanfare, and I'm a big fanfare about kind of Gen Z are going to change the world with their purchase decisions, and it's just not happening and not true really at all, because what they say versus what they do are two completely different things. But we still need to kind of looking at as we get more climate shocks and implications from climate change, is that going to mean that we need to start changing how things are priced, and therefore then you can start having better conversation around profit and loss. But I think it's that risk conversation that is much more important for sustainability and sustainability practitioners to speak that language of increasingly than necessarily looking at purpose or looking at kind of the whole notion of doing good. And maybe I've just become incredibly cynical, and I was called very cynical the other day, and maybe I have. It's just what happens, I suppose, as well. But I just think that rationality needs to be much more part of the conversation than necessarily being wanting to do the right thing all the time.
So true. Yeah.
I'm cynical. Anyone can call me cynical now. I feel shame.
I don't mind that. Look, we're running out of time. I think we have time for only one question, which I'm going to select from what we have in the Q&A. It's around organizations beginning their sustainability journey, what are the top immediate actions that you would advise communicators and business owners at large to consider when to build a solid foundation when they embark on this sustainability journey, whatever that means?
Yeah, you've got to know where you are, and you've got to know and who are the people that you're most influenced by what you're doing as a business. So it's understand your baseline of the impact you have, and then and who are your partners within that, and the changes you need to make. So and this is where carbon was such an important and a useful way of people developing that baseline, because it gave you something to measure, gave you something to understand. Increasingly, the conversation is going to be around biodiversity and nature and natural degradation and kind of nature loss, and as well as regeneration that we need to kind of factor into the conversation. But I think it's those choices that you can make as a business to say, well, what are the areas that we can have most influence on, and understand how our business makes money and how our business produces the goods or the services that they're creating. So getting that baseline, that understanding that comes from materiality is incredibly important, but don't get bogged down in the kind of just looking insular, but then start looking around kind of, well, these are things that we can kind of make changes on, and then and then also overlay that with kind of where the risks might be in the future. So from a communications perspective, it's around enabling that communication flow happening really easily within your company. I think internal comms and that kind of ability to kind of speak the same language across the business is going to become ever more important. And I'm, surprised when it's not. This is much more of an internal focused exercise. And only when you have a story to tell that impacts a particular audience that kind of drives the change you need to see, that's when it needs to become something more external, or you need to build bridges with stakeholders. Can drive things, but getting that consistency within a company and a consistent understanding of what you're trying to achieve is probably the first thing to be focused on.
And it requires, I guess, adapting and adjusting. It's one of those areas where communicators need to work with a lot of internal stakeholders, technical staff, maybe even upskill to understand the complexities, right?
And also and start getting a common language and common measurements. And I mean, for me, communications people are the great dot connectors. We're the people who ask the tricky questions, who connect the dots within different parts of the business, who are able to kind of get that red thread happening through a company. And if we're not doing that, then the question is why, and how do we upskill ourselves? But how do we kind of ensure that the language we're speaking is the language that people are actually understanding as well? So I think there's a real opportunity to kind of get that together with comms people.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm afraid we're running out of time, but 2 points that I want to leave everyone with at the end of this conversation. Number one is follow Natasha on LinkedIn, Natasha Plowman at Spinning Red, and I'm sure she'll be happy to answer any questions and help advise and work with you on those challenges. I think the second one for me personally is look up Higher Ground by Alison Taylor. I'm definitely doing that, and will try and educate myself over the Christmas holidays. It's a topic and it's an area that's becoming increasingly relevant and complex. It's not becoming simpler, on the contrary, right? It's becoming more and more complicated. And beyond sustainability, the kind of wider definition of ESG involves multiple other areas within societal, governmental, political risk, and everything else that goes with them. And we see how complicated the world is becoming, not least because of political developments. So thank you so much, Natasha. We're really grateful for your time and your generosity. It's been a thought-provoking masterclass and a lot of information for us to take in. And I'm sure we'll be reflecting on that in the days and weeks to come. Thanks for joining Carbon Measurement Month and Ruepoint for this masterclass. And thanks everyone for joining us. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you. Thanks, Natasha.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.